The street was eerily quiet as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. It was one of those neighborhoods where people tended to mind their own business, where curiosity could get you into trouble. An old man shuffled along the sidewalk, his cane tapping rhythmically against the ground. His weathered face, framed by a graying beard, was calm, almost serene, as though he were lost in thought. He wore a faded army jacket, its patches and insignias dulled by time, but still bearing silent testimony to battles fought long ago. A group of young men loitered near the corner store, their laughter cutting through the stillness like shards of glass. They were dressed in sagging jeans and oversized hoodies, their postures radiating cocky confidence. To them, the old man was just another easy target, someone they could toy with for a laugh or maybe even profit. One of them nudged his friend, nodding toward the man. "Yo, check him out," he said with a smirk. "Old dude looks like he's about to fall over. Bet he's got some cash on him, though." The group chuckled, their voices growing louder as they watched the old man approach. He didn't seem to notice them at first, his focus on the path ahead. But there was something about the way he carried himself. His stride was steady, deliberate, despite his apparent age. It was as if he was used to walking into danger and coming out the other side. "Hey, old man," one of the young men called out, stepping into his path. The others followed, forming a loose circle around him. Their grins widened, their bravado growing as they fed off each other's energy. The old man stopped, his dark eyes sweeping over the group. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Can I help you boys?" he asked, his voice calm and steady with just a hint of weariness. One of the thugs, a tall kid with a bandana tied around his head, stepped forward. He was clearly the leader, his chest puffed out as he tried to look intimidating. "Yeah, you can help us," he sneered. "How about you hand over whatever you got in your pockets?" The old man raised an eyebrow, his hand tightening slightly on the handle of his cane. "Is that so?" he said, his tone still unshaken. There was no fear in his voice, only a quiet confidence that made the group pause for a split second before their leader laughed. "Man, you better listen while we're still asking nice." Another one chimed in, his voice edged with impatience. The old man sighed, his eyes flickering briefly toward the fading sun. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if weighing his options. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You boys have no idea what you're getting yourselves into." The group erupted into laughter, their mocking voices echoing down the empty street. "What, you gonna hit us with your cane?" One of them jeered, doubling over with laughter. But the old man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a small step forward, his gaze locking onto the leaders. The laughter died down as the young man found himself unable to look away. There was something unsettling in the old man's eyes, something sharp, like a blade hidden beneath layers of calm. "You ever been in a real fight, son?" the old man asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. The leader scoffed, trying to shake off the sudden unease that crept up his spine. "Yeah, plenty of them," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. The old man nodded, almost as if he respected the lie. "Then you know there's a difference between fighting to win and fighting to survive. I learned that the hard way in a jungle halfway across the world." The group exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, the old man's army jacket caught their attention. One of them muttered, "Yo, is he a vet or something?" Before anyone could answer, the old man shifted his weight, standing a little straighter. The years seemed to fall away from him, replaced by something harder, sharper, a presence that demanded attention. "You boys think you're tough," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "But toughness isn't about how loud you talk or how many friends you've got backing you up. Toughness is being alone in the dark, with nothing but your will to keep you alive." The leader took a step back, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. "Man, you're full of stories. We don't care about your war or whatever. Just hand over your stuff, old man." The old man didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down the leader's spine. "You're right," he said. "You don't care, but you will." Before anyone could react, the old man's cane shifted in his hand, its polished wood glinting in the fading light. The group froze, suddenly unsure of what they were dealing with. And then, with a voice as calm as the eye of a storm, the old man said, "You've made a mistake tonight, boys, a big one." The tension in the air was electric, every eye locked on the old man as the street seemed to hold its breath. What happened next would leave an impression none of them would ever forget. But for now, the moment hung in perfect, terrifying stillness. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the few leaves left clinging to the branches above. The old man's words lingered, and for a moment, None of the young men dared to speak. The leader's eyes darted around, as if searching for some kind of signal from his crew, but none of them met his gaze. There was something unspoken in the air, a feeling they couldn't quite explain but felt deep in their bones. The old man's grip on the cane loosened, though his posture didn't change. He didn't seem angry. If anything, he looked patient, like he'd seen this before. The kind of patience that came from experience, the kind that unsettled the young men more than any threat could. Finally, the leader laughed, though it sounded forced, hollow. "Man, whatever. You're just an old dude trying to scare us with war stories. Ain't nobody afraid of that." His words didn't carry the weight he wanted them to. Even the others glanced at him sideways. One of them, shorter than the rest, shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat and spoke softly. "Maybe we should just bounce, man. He's not worth the trouble." The leader shot him a glare. "What? You scared now?" "Nah, I'm just saying. I don't feel like dealing with this." The shorter one shrugged, his eyes flicking to the old man again. There was something about the way the veteran stood there, still and steady but not weak. Not like someone who could be easily dismissed. "You should listen to your friend," the old man said, his tone even but not unkind. "There's no shame in walking away." That seemed to sting the leader more than any insult could have. His jaw tightened, and he squared his shoulders, stepping closer. He was trying to reclaim the upper hand, but the closer he got, the clearer it became that the old man wasn't backing down. "You talk like you know everything," the leader spat, his bravado rising. "What makes you so sure you can handle us?" The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes softened, and for the first time, he looked tired. Not physically, but in a way that hinted at memories far heavier than the situation at hand. His gaze drifted past the young men, as if he was seeing something they couldn't. "Because I've faced worse than this," he said quietly. "Much worse." The leader opened his mouth to fire back, but the words didn't come. Something about the way the old man spoke felt different. It wasn't a threat, but it held weight, a reminder that life had shown him things no one should ever have to see. The shorter thug shifted again, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yo, was it bad? Like the stuff you saw?" The old man's eyes met his, and for a second, the hardened lines on his face softened. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but that's not what matters. What matters is that I got through it. And I didn't do it by pretending to be tough." His words landed harder than any swing could have. Even the leader seemed to feel the shift. The street, once a place where they felt in control, now felt smaller, like they were out of their depth in ways they hadn't realized until now. One of the others finally broke the silence. "Yo, you were really in Vietnam?" The old man nodded. "I was." "Did you, I know, ever have to?" The question hung in the air, unfinished. The old man's gaze didn't falter. "War isn't about wanting to fight. It's about surviving. And sometimes that means doing things you wish you didn't have to." The group exchanged glances again. None of them could fully grasp what that meant, but they knew enough to understand they were outmatched, not by strength, but by something deeper. Still, the leader held his ground, though his shoulders slumped slightly. He felt the control slipping away, and he wasn't sure how to get it back. "So what, you expect us to just leave?" he asked, though the challenge in his voice had dimmed. The old man let out a small sigh, as if he'd been through this conversation more times than he could count. "I expect you to think about the kind of men you want to be," he replied simply. "You can spend your days picking on people you think are weaker, or you can learn that real strength comes from helping others, not hurting them." His words hung there, heavier than the setting sun behind them. The young men stood still, unsure how to respond. The shorter one nudged the leader. "Let's go, man. I'm done." There was a pause, and for a brief second, the leader looked like he might argue. But something in his expression shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was respect he didn't want to admit. With a frustrated sigh, he shook his head. "Whatever," he muttered. "This ain't even worth it." One by one, the group began to drift away, their footsteps echoing softly down the street. The leader lingered for a moment longer, eyes meeting the old man's one last time. "You're lucky we're letting this slide," he said, though even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. The old man offered a faint smile. "Take care of yourself, son." Without another word, the leader turned and followed his crew into the fading light. The old man watched them disappear around the corner, his eyes thoughtful but unreadable. For a long time he stood there, listening to the distant sounds of the city slowly settling into night. And then, with the same steady gait, he resumed his walk, his cane tapping softly against the pavement, carrying him forward into the growing dusk. The old man's footsteps echoed softly as he crossed the street, his cane tapping with each measured step. The sun had almost completely slipped below the horizon now, leaving behind a warm glow that stretched lazily across the rooftops. The air was cooling, and the city seemed quieter, as if the brief encounter had left its mark not just on the boys, but on the streets themselves. He paused for a moment near a flickering street lamp, adjusting the strap on his warm leather bag. His shoulders ached faintly, a dull, familiar pain that came and went like an old friend. The years had added weight he hadn't asked for, but he carried it without complaint. It was part of him now, stitched into the fabric of who he was. Further down the block, a young woman stepped out of a corner store, fumbling with her keys. Her eyes flicked toward him, lingering just long enough to show curiosity but not fear. She offered a polite nod, and he returned it with a small, knowing smile. As he passed her, he could hear the faint murmur of her phone call, something about work, or maybe a friend's plans for the weekend. Normal things. The kind of conversations he used to have before life took him elsewhere. The night stretched on as he walked, and the old man found himself wandering further than usual. His usual route would have taken him home by now, but his feet carried him past familiar streets and into quieter parts of the neighborhood. He didn't mind. The walk gave him time to think. The faces of those boys lingered in his mind, especially the shorter one, the one who seemed ready to leave from the start. There was hesitation in his eyes, but not malice. The old man wondered how much influence that kid really had in the group, or if he was just another follower, hoping to keep the peace without drawing attention to himself. A faint rustling in the alley beside him caught his attention. The old man slowed, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced over. Two figures stood near the chain-link fence, their voices low but tense. He didn't recognize them, but their body language told him enough. One of them, a lanky teenager with a red hoodie, glanced nervously over his shoulder. The other, an older man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, kept talking in hushed, hurried tones. The old man didn't stop. He'd learned long ago when to get involved and when to let things play out. This wasn't his business. Not tonight. But just as he crossed the alley's mouth, the older man's voice cut through the quiet. "You better not screw this up. I ain't saving you next time." The old man's steps faltered. His eyes flicked back toward them, but neither seemed to notice him. Red Hoodie nodded quickly, shoving something into his pocket before the older man turned and walked away. The kid stayed behind for a moment, his back pressed against the fence. He exhaled sharply, watching the other man disappear down the street before stepping out into the light. The old man resumed walking, but his pace slowed. The boy wasn't much older than the group he'd encountered earlier. His eyes were sharper, but there was a weight in his posture that didn't belong to someone his age. Their paths crossed without a word, but as the kid passed, he looked up, just for a second. His gaze lingered on the old man's army jacket, the faded patches catching the light from the street lamp above. "You served?" the boy asked, his voice cautious but curious. The old man stopped, turning his head slightly. "A long time ago," he replied. The boy shifted on his feet, as if debating whether to ask more. Finally he shrugged. "My uncle did too. Army, I think." The old man nodded, sensing the unspoken questions hanging between them. "It stays with you," he said quietly, "even when you think it won't." The boy didn't respond right away. His hand drifted toward his pocket, where the old man suspected he'd hidden whatever the older man had given him. "You look like someone with choices to make," the old man said, watching him carefully. The boy's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no anger, just recognition. "Maybe," the kid admitted, tugging his hoodie tighter around himself. They stood there for a moment longer, neither in a hurry to move. Eventually the boy shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and gave a faint nod. "Take care, old man." "You too," the old man replied, watching as the kid disappeared around the corner. The streets were quiet again, but the night felt heavier, somehow like the city itself was holding its breath. The old man continued his walk, the distant hum of passing cars his only company. He didn't know what choice the kid would make tomorrow or the day after. But as he walked beneath the flickering lights, he hoped, in whatever small way he could, that the boy remembered their brief exchange. Sometimes that's all it took to steer a person away from something worse. The wind whispered softly through the alley as the old man vanished into the night, leaving behind only the faint echo of his cane against the pavement. The old man's walk home took him past the park, its edges dimly lit by scattered streetlights. The shadows beneath the trees stretched long and thin, swaying gently in the breeze. He slowed his pace, feeling that familiar tug of instinct, the quiet voice in the back of his mind that always seemed to know when something wasn't right. Further down the path, just near the playground, he spotted them again. The same group of boys from earlier huddled near a bench. Their voices were low but sharp, the tension palpable even from a distance. The tallest one stood with his arms crossed, shoulders squared, while the others shifted nervously around him. The old man paused just at the edge of the park, partially hidden by the dark. His eyes lingered on the shorter boy, the one who had hesitated before. He was standing a little apart from the rest, arms folded across his chest like a thin layer of armor. His eyes darted around, not in fear but in quiet calculation, as if he were already searching for a way out. The tallest boy leaned in closer to the others, his voice rising just enough for the old man to catch fragments. There was frustration in his tone, and something else? Pressure, maybe. Whatever it was, the group wasn't laughing this time. The old man took a step forward, his cane tapping softly against the path. The sound carried, drawing their attention almost immediately. The tallest boy's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing as recognition set in. "What's he doing here?" one of them muttered under his breath. The old man didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, letting the weight of his presence settle. Finally, he stopped a few paces away, far enough to give them space but close enough that his eyes could meet theirs. "Evening," he said calmly, his gaze steady. The tallest boy straightened, his jaw tightening. "You following us or something?" The old man shook his head. "Just out for a walk," he replied. His tone was even, but there was something beneath it, a quiet authority that made the group shift uneasily. "Didn't think I'd see you boys twice in one day." For a moment, no one spoke. The shorter boy glanced between the old man and the leader, clearly reading the tension that hung in the air. "You're lucky we let you walk away the first time," the tallest one finally said, though his voice didn't carry the same weight as before. The old man's gaze didn't waver. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he replied, his tone soft but deliberate. The group fell silent again. The shortest boy shifted his weight, and the old man caught the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, relief, maybe, or recognition. "You know," the old man continued, his voice carrying in the still night air, "I've seen this before. Different faces, same choices." His grip on the cane tightened slightly. "I remember the ones who walked away, and the ones who didn't." The tallest boy's eyes narrowed, but there was something else now. Curiosity, though he tried to hide it. "What happened to him?" one of the others asked quietly. The old man let the question hang for a moment before he spoke again. "Some of them learned the hard way," he said, "and some listened when someone gave him a reason to stop." The shorter boy's gaze flicked toward him again, just for a second. The old man could see the indecision etched into his features, the silent war playing out behind his eyes. He'd seen it too many times before, in younger men who thought they were invincible until life proved otherwise. The tallest boy stepped forward slightly, as if trying to reclaim the ground he felt slipping beneath him. "We're not looking for a lesson," he said, though the edge in his voice had dulled. The old man nodded slowly. "Maybe not," he said, "but sometimes you don't realize you need one until it's too late." The words hung there, caught in the space between them. The shorter boy shifted again, his foot nudging the gravel beneath him. He wasn't looking at the others anymore. His eyes were fixed on the old man, and for the first time that night, he seemed to stand a little straighter. The old man didn't press any further. He knew when to let silence do the talking. With a faint nod, he stepped back, turning toward the path that led him home. As he walked away, he could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't look back. Some lessons took time to sink in, and he knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The night deepened around him, but the faintest flicker of hope followed him home. The old man's steps faded into the night, but the boys lingered near the bench, watching until he disappeared around the corner. The tallest one, Jamal, kept his arms crossed tight over his chest, his eyes narrowed as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. The others shifted uneasily, waiting for him to say something. "That old dude talks too much," one of them muttered, kicking at a loose rock. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. His gaze flicked toward Marcus, the shorter boy who can eye the old man more than anyone else. "You got something to say, Marcus?" Jamal's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, but not angry. Marcus hesitated, his fingers tapping against the edge of his sleeve. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice low. "I think he was trying to tell us something, like he's been where we're at." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "You don't know us," he shot back, but there was no fire behind the words. Marcus didn't argue. He just gave a small shrug, the kind that said he wasn't so sure anymore. The group started drifting apart soon after, murmured goodnights shared without much energy. One by one, they disappeared down the dark streets until only Jamal and Marcus were left. Jamal sat down on the bench, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Marcus lingered nearby, hands stuffed into his hui pocket. The silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken thoughts settling in the air. "You really think he's been through it?" Jamal finally asked, not looking up. Marcus glanced down the street, as if half expecting to see the old man still standing there. "I think he's seen more than we have," he said. "Ain't nothing fake about that look in his eyes." Jamal didn't respond right away. He stared at the ground, lips pressed into a tight line, before letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Maybe," he admitted. But just as Marcus opened his mouth to say something else, the sharp screech of tires cut through the night air. Both boys' heads snapped up, eyes locking onto a car speeding down the street toward them. The car jerked to a stop a few feet away, engine humming low and steady. The windows were tinted, but Marcus caught the faint outline of someone in the driver's seat. Jamal straightened, his shoulders tensing. "You know them?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice tight. Jamal's eyes narrowed as the driver's side window rolled down just enough to reveal a shadowed face. A cigarette glowed faintly in the darkness, illuminating the sharp curve of a grin. "Nah," Jamal said, standing up slowly. "But I got a bad feeling about this." Before Marcus could respond, the man behind the wheel leaned out slightly, his voice low but clear. "Yo, Jamal, got a minute?" Jamal stiffened, recognizing the voice instantly. It was the same man Marcus had seen earlier in the alley, the one who'd been talking to the kid in the red hoodie. Marcus felt his stomach twist. "That's him," he whispered. Jamal's eyes flicked to Marcus. "Stay here," he muttered, stepping toward the car. Marcus grabbed his arm before he could take another step. "Hold up, man. You sure about this?" Jamal hesitated just long enough for Marcus to see the doubt flash across his face, but then he shook his head. "I got it," he said, gently pulling his arm free. Marcus watched nervously as Jamal approached the car, leaning down just enough to talk through the open window. Their voices were low, too quiet for him to make out the words, but the tension was clear. Jamal's posture shifted slightly, shoulders squared, head tilting just enough to suggest he didn't like what he was hearing. The man in the car leaned closer, his cigarette glowing brighter as he spoke. After a few moments, Jamal stepped back, his jaw tight. The car lingered for a beat longer before the window rolled up and the tires screeched again, peeling off into the night. Jamal didn't move, staring down the street long after the car disappeared. Marcus waited, unsure whether to say anything, but the silence between them felt heavier than before. What did he want? Marcus finally asked, his voice careful. Jamal's eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. "Nothing good," he said quietly. The wind picked up, rustling the trees overhead. Marcus stuffed his hands deeper into his pockets, the unease in his chest growing stronger by the second. "That old man was right," Marcus said after a long pause. "Some choices, they stick with you." Jamal didn't say anything, but his expression said enough. Marcus could see it, the crossroads standing right in front of him, waiting for a decision to be made. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which direction Jamal would take.